Okay, good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to this e-Memoir session where we're looking at improving the quality of study programmes to meet funding and quality requirements. Session is going to be led by Bees Kaczmarczyk, and we like to keep these webinar sessions as interactive as possible, so please feel free to use the question or chat facility. If you'd like to use your phone or your microphone, which is attached to your laptop or PC or tablet, just let me know. I'll be more than happy to activate it for you if you've got a question that you'd like to put to us. You'll receive a copy of the video recording and the slides. I encourage you to share these with your team, and if you've got any questions, come back to us as we're always happy to help. So I'm going to hand over to Beej now, and I'll mute my mic. Thanks a lot, Beej.
Thanks very much, Marek, and good morning to everyone. Good morning particularly to our subscribers, but also to those new listeners, and welcome to this morning's webinar. Over the next 50 to 55 minutes, plus about 10 minutes or so for questions, I hope to be able to cover all the things that you wanted to know about improving the quality of study programs, not only to meet audit and funding requirements, but also increasingly to meet the requirements of Ofsted, as well as obviously for your own internal quality assurance and improvement. A full range of providers listening in this morning, so thanks again, particularly to our regulars. This will be an update to the last webinar we did on study programs, which was way back in February of this year. And since then, we've delivered this program also internally to several colleges, some training providers, and also groups of people from a range of providers. So hopefully we're updating it to take account of what we're finding out from Ofsted, but also finding out from you, particularly in terms of the way you're planning study programs for 2017-18, which will be the 5th year of delivery of study programs. So let's sort of start off by looking at some of what I'd call this sort of contextual issues. And I think, given all of us are facing, uncertainty about the future funding of 16 to 19 provision, I think the key drivers for having not only cost-efficient study programs, which ones, which deliver viable groups of learners to you, balance the books, whatever. There's an increasing emphasis also on the effectiveness of those study programs in terms of obviously outcomes, destinations, attainment for the learners, as well as obviously the quality of the experience they have over the 1 or 2, or in some cases 3 years of their study program. So these drivers come from, first of all, cuts in real terms funding. This is the 5th year when the level of funding for 16 to 19-year-olds has been set at £4,000 for 16 and 17-year-olds and £3,300 for 18-year-olds, with some exceptions. And that in money terms has been protected and would have been protected to the end of the Parliament, because of course that came a little bit prematurely this year. And obviously we don't know what's going to happen next year, but obviously there have been significant demands to see an increase in the money funding for the funding for 16 to 19 years in money terms, which would obviously overcompensate for some of the cuts in real terms funding. Think about inflation, think about your costs, certainly since 2010, and you'll see that in real terms there's less money for each one of those learners. There's increasing emphasis also on making sure that your study programs are relevant to the needs not only of the national labour market in terms of preparation for higher education and employment, but increasingly for local and sub-regional labour markets. And this was obviously evidenced very much in the area review process, which looked at colleges in particular, but also drew in data from training providers, school sixth forms and academies. So, how relevant is your study program to meeting the needs of those labour markets, to particularly allow entry into employment and, of course, preferably into apprenticeship. So I think that's another major thread that certainly is coming through not only in the area review process, but also in inspection. One of the concerns that certainly has been expressed by a lot of inspectors is how little change in terms of innovation and the implementation of new methods of learning, new technology there has been in study programs. So I think there is a significant push here to see some sustained development of more innovative approaches to learning, including obviously the use of those new technology, but obviously appropriately. All of this, of course, is bound by the requirements to make sure that the quality of those programs is assured, and increasingly the quality of those programs is improved. So it's not just about meeting standards or the requirements of Ofsted, but how are we building in improvements in attainment, progress, and in particular destinations to those outcomes that those learners are seeking. And obviously that has a big emphasis on, for example, the outcomes for learners, the current learners, not historic, but also what's happening in terms of current learners, in terms of their progress, and they're moving on to those destinations that they've identified in their learning plans or in the initial advice and guidance. And of course, still there, despite what might have been said before the election, is the requirement to meet the condition of funding for the appropriate delivery of English and Maths to those learners that haven't yet attained those standards, those minimum standards that are required. And that will still be driving a lot of your decision making, certainly over the short term in terms of 17-18. So those drivers for cost effectiveness have got us thinking not only about the funding for study programs and those 16 to 19-year-olds on study programs, but what are the conditions attached to that funding? So for example, the English and Maths condition, as well as obviously those protections that have been offered to those providers that might have had quite high costed programs of learning when this new funding formula came into place. So what do we know for 17-18? And this obviously has already been confirmed by the ESFA. The guidance documents are there. You've had your allocations. The current funding rates have been maintained, as I said, £4,000 for 16, 17-year-olds to have a programme of at least 540 hours, 3,300 if they're 18-year-olds, plus obviously the smaller bands for part-time students. We know that those of you who have been getting formula funding protection since 2015, that is going to be finally phased out by 2020 to achieve some savings, but of course made up for partly by the increased funding for larger programs of equivalent to 4 and 5 A levels. We know the English and Maths condition of funding tolerance, which has allowed some of your learners not to meet the funding condition and still be funded. That tolerance level will be maintained, which was applied this year, will also be applied next year, and I'll come back to that. We also know that the rate of funding for free school meals is going to be kept at £2.41 per day per learner. And that's not different from the current year. But one change that has been introduced in 17-18 is that those learners that used to be 19 and over who were on study programs who would switch to what was the Skills Funding Agency funding formula, allocation, but using the study program funding formula, which I'm going to look at with you, they will now be obviously funded by the EFA, but to some extent that's irrelevant since of course those two agencies are now merged. But what is important is that they will appear in your allocation for 16 to 19-year-olds this year as opposed to in the adult allocation which you would have had in previous years. One other change to note, by the way, which indirectly impacts on you is that the disadvantaged funding, which used to be in 2 blocks, one block that reflected the postal code of your students based obviously on historical data from the ILR. The block 2, which took account of prior attainment in English and Maths, in other words, all those learners that didn't meet the minimum requirement of at least a grade 4, previously a grade C, would have got you extra funding. That used to be used what we call calculated using matched administrative data, which was sometimes 3 years out of date. That will now use the ILR, and there'll still be a lag, but at least it won't be a 3-year lag. One little minor point to make, to note, is that if you do change the planned hours for a study program, say the learner does an extra qualification or drops a particular program or changes the program altogether, if those changes occur within the first 6 weeks, you must update them on the ILR. After that, obviously, you're already, the impact will be obviously not felt to the next year. What you've also got to be aware of, particularly those of you who have significant numbers of high needs students, is there is a consultation and has been a consultation on actually developing a different funding formula for the allocations for high needs students in terms of the funding that goes to local authorities the top-up funding in particular. How that comes from the local authority to you, the provider, will still be very much based on those models that you're quite familiar with in terms of identifying those needs, agreeing that they have an education healthcare plan and the appropriate level of support for that learner above the £6,000. So that's something that's obviously being consulted on. Now, those are the main funding headlines. The funding formula itself, therefore, doesn't really change. So when you're looking at the number of students you've got who are on study programs, each individual student draws down funding for the totality of their study program. In other words, all the hours. So obviously the key driver here is your lag number effect, the student numbers, the national rate of funding, which has stayed the same. The retention factor was based on obviously historical data based on ILR for 2015-16, ILR 14, R14, which, or the school census data, which would have shown you the proportion of learners retained on their core learning aim. The program cost weightings have stayed the same. If you're running A-levels and GCSEs, they're all weighted at A. Vocational programs have got different weightings. These are obviously weighted taking account of the number of learners in your cohort and the size of those learners. As I said, the disadvantage funding, Block 1 and Block 2, slightly different basis for calculating Block 2. And as you know now, there's also a large program element which takes account of the bigger programs that some of your students might be doing, such as, say, 4 A-levels, International Baccalaureate, 5 A-levels or equivalent, and how that can get you extra funding as long as those learners achieve. Remember, it's not just funding for the size of the program, it's funding for the achievement of those larger programs, at least at grade B. All of that gives you the program funding. The formula protection funding, which some of you get, will eventually run out. We know that some of you have lost funding because your maths and English condition of funding is beyond tolerance, and that is giving you total funding, to which we then add the high need students funding, again based on last year's data, each one of those students at £6,000, plus of course the student support funding, which takes account of free school meals and discretionary learner support where it's appropriate to those learners. That formula does not change. But you can see that in there are already some particular performance issues. And clearly, when you're looking at funding requirements, even though we're talking about the same rate of funding, there are some significant funding requirements in terms of, for example, the impact of student numbers. So, for example, if your numbers fell last year, this year, in the coming year, that's 17-18, you'll see a decline in your funding and vice versa. We still require those students who are 16 and 17 to do a minimum of 540 hours. So the more students you've got coming in at 16 and 17, but perhaps because of demography, the more funding you'll get. But obviously we know that on average, those learners will be doing about 600 hours of qualification and non-qualification time. The more students you've got on the part-time bands, obviously, the less funding you get per student. So you can actually see an increase in your student numbers, but a decrease in your funding because the allocation between the bands has changed. Actually, in most cases, it's been the reverse of that. The increasing proportion of students now on full-time programs is quite significant, and it's almost 95% of all learners. Just want to remind you that a student doesn't earn any funding unless they've become a start. So clearly a quality issue there as opposed to a funding issue is how many learners left you before 6 weeks. How many learners never actually attended ever, even though you might have offered them a place? And that clearly is a quality issue. And by the way, even if the program is a condensed program, the minimum of 42 days still applies. So if you've got any program that has a significant amount of hours, even though it might be delivered in a shorter period of time, we still apply the minimum of 6 weeks before the person becomes a start. There are, of course, 14 days for much shorter programs, but that's, again, a relatively small number of students. The only other thing, as I said, is that 19-year-old learners that are continuing, who began the program before when they were 16 to 18, they will now be part of your allocation for study program students, in other words, for your 16 to 19. So I think one of the big issues there is clearly that those numbers are critical, and that will be the first determinant of your performance, what's happened to the numbers compared to what you might have planned. And if those numbers have gone down through the lag number effect, you know that your allocation will be reduced, and similarly, if it's gone the other way, it could have increased. As I said, the national funding rates have stayed the same, but we must make sure that our 16 and 17-year-olds are obviously on programs of at least 540 hours. I'll come back to the audit requirement for the 540 hours as well. Just to note that all students aged 19 to 24 who have an education and healthcare plan, there will not be any more learning difficulty assessments. They've all disappeared. They'll be funded at the full rate, so they'll be funded at the £4,000 rate. Obviously, that's been applied up to now. As I said, much of the data that we use to inform the numbers, the funding rates, etc., and the different, aspects of the funding formula were based on your outturn data for 15-16. So you can see there the various, the bands. The 17-18 bands are therefore not in any way different from 16-17. One of the issues, of course, is proving that those annual hours are actually going to be delivered. And we've already got a question. One of you has asked, how do we get to 540 hours if we have someone who wants to do 3 A-levels, let's say the 3 linear A-levels, and they're 16 to 17 and they've already passed English and maths? And obviously I'll come back to that, but one of the issues there is that when you construct the program, it's supposed to be constructed around the personal and individual needs of the student in terms of the likely destinations. So we take account the start point, look at the destination, and then what program will best deliver that destination. In this case, if they're wanting to do 3 A-levels and go into HE, then we'll have to make sure there's enough hours for the 3 A-levels, which will form the core. One of those will be the core learning aim. There'll be tutorial. I would suggest that if they're aiming to improve their performance, then there'll be some study skills program that you'll run, and that will have to be a resourced program organised by you and delivered by you, even if it's online. And I would suggest also that there might be some time for those learners to also attend open days, accompanied by staff, guest speakers who come in to talk about HE, UCAS preparation. So again, it's how you get up to the 540 hours using that appropriate mix of activities. And I think the key thing here is that those activities must actually happen. They must be resourced, they must be timetabled, they must be organised. And that applies to all the hours. Even if you're in a band 3 situation where you've got a traineeship, those hours must appear on a student's timetable. They must be planned and organised by, and I'll come back to that because that's meeting the funding requirement is absolutely critical, and they must actually be in some way recorded, either through registers, through online registers, through some monitoring system, or obviously through things like those who log on and log off if it's an IT-based system. So I think it's critical, therefore, that we get that concept out, and despite this being we're preparing now for the 5th year of study programs, we have still had some ILR audits of providers that have failed to actually appreciate the significance of those hours in terms of the funding, but making sure that those hours actually are planned, are timetabled, that the students see those as soon as possible. I would suggest by the time they're inducted, they've got a clear understanding of how many hours they're going to do, and those hours must take place, or there must be a reasonable chance of those hours taking place. So just 1 or 2 issues there. As I said, for purposes of funding, meeting the funding requirement, when you plan your study program, the hours must be relevant to the study program. So in other words, for example, the way I made up that program for the 3 A-level student who's already passed English and Maths at grade A start to C or grade 4 to 9, then the 450 hours for the 3 A-levels, the 36 hours for the tutorial, the 36 hours for study skills, the 30 hours for guest speakers, open days, UCAS preparation, and enrichment activities. You can evidence that that is relevant to that student's destination. Why are they doing those things? Because they want to go on to higher education. It must be planned and timetabled by you. It must be organised by you, and in some cases, or supervised by you, because obviously you might have someone else that's coming in from as a guest speaker. We'd assume that one member staff would supervise that, although you might have a large group size. It must be within the normal working pattern of your institution. So if it's a 6th form college, we'd assume that's during the daytime. If it's a generally fee college, that could also include evenings and weekends if they're vocational students. It must be quality assured by use. In other words, it must be subject to the students giving feedback, must be subject to observation, walkthroughs, the normal systems you do for recording the activity and the quality of the activity, such as what impact it's had and feedback from the learners. But finally, it must be resourced and incur a cost. Now, you might only be paying for a package, but that package, if it's an e-package, still costs you money. You might be paying someone who's a progress coach to do some tutorial, or a facilitator, or an assessor. However, you're incurring a cost. So again, I think by now there should be less issues around whether we're meeting the requirements, certainly, of the funding agencies and the auditors in terms of the way you've designed the study program. So the audit of 16 to 19 study programs, which in most cases has not been an issue, it has, however, led to one or two institutions having funding taken off them. We obviously go through the normal process of making sure the student exists and are eligible to be funded. We obviously have to make sure they're eligible to be either in the band 5, or one of the other bands. And the activities that appear on their plan, the timetable, which we hope the students get fairly early on, which tells them what the organisation is committing them to the learners to, so it's a contract, that those activities are eligible to be funded. So for example, if you've got tutorial, the tutorial is staffed. If you've got an enrichment programme, the enrichment programme is being organised and costed. It isn't voluntary type activities which don't incur any cost. I think it's important to realise that auditors are interested in the fact that you've put on the provision, and then you're emphasising how important it is for the students to attend tutorials, English and Maths, their core programme, whatever they're doing, as well as their work experience, or of course to achieve the outcomes if they can achieve them quicker. And that's very significant also from the point of view of inspection, because as you know, one aspect of personal development, behaviour and welfare is students' behaviour, attendance and their commitment to their programmes. And clearly there's a link there between audit and Ofsted. I think it's also important that there's a clear rationale why the learner has chosen a core learning aim, for example, their A-level programme. So if their pathway is into chemical engineering, maths, physics, chemistry, biology would be a useful combination. If the pathway is into, for example, construction, that they're doing a level 2 and level 3 diploma. Whether students being provided with relevant information, advice and guidance, an initial assessment, a learning plan and a timetable of activity, that's got to be clear. And by the way, this has been a weakness, one of the weaknesses or several of the weaknesses identified Ofsted. They often said that the initial advice and guidance was not significantly of good quality. That, for example, a lot of internal progressing students have been put on the wrong programs, that entry requirements have not been properly applied. So you can see that although that's an audit issue, it's also coming up in Ofsted. And that's why you can see the importance of some of these indicators of performance for both funding requirements and also for Ofsted requirements. I always think that if learners do not have, by the end of their induction, a clear plan of what they're going to do and a timetable of activity, even though you might not have placed, for example, all the enrichment activities by end of induction, or you might not have actually identified in which week they're going to do the work experience or where that's going to be, at least they know that there will be a work experience equivalent to a week, and obviously we hope to find that as soon as we can. I think it's important that work experience arrangements, where they're applicable, particularly to those learners who are not progressing into HE, who will certainly benefit from work experience. I think it's critical that you have the evidence of that work experience, whether it be something that's spread over a period of time, done in a block of 1 or 2 weeks, or however you've organised it to meet the needs of the learner and the employer. I'll come back to the thing about the A-level students and work experience in a minute. I think the clear thing here, obviously, is that now we're building in the GCSE Maths and English prior attainment, because obviously that tells us whether you've met the condition, whether the learners have started with it, therefore they've met the condition, if they've then done an English and Maths program and therefore the condition has been met as well. And obviously those that haven't met the condition, that's got to be reported. But also it can show us what progress learners are making, particularly if they came in at 1 grade in GCSE and they've moved to a different grade, we can start to measure value added. So all of that is used to determine whether the student is being funded at the appropriate level based on the planned attendance. And one thing they'll watch out for, by the way, auditors will watch out for, is intensive programs where 540 or 600 hours are delivered in, say, 6 months or less, so less than 24 weeks. They'll be watching out for that in case there is some evidence of you deliberately conflating programs to maximize your funding. So here's an example from a small college based in London. You can see it's got 1,016 to 19 learners. Most of them are full-time, they're 1 or 2 part-time. It's got a retention rate of 92%, which means a retention factor of 96%. Remember, the 8% of students who are not retained still earn you half of their funding rate, half the 4,000. You can see it's mostly academic, so this could be predominantly an A-level type college. Some money coming in from postal codes, some money coming in from prior English and maths grades. It's in central London, so it gets an uplift of 20%. There's the 5 million before we start looking at high need students. This college met the condition of funding adjustment, so it had no money. No money taken off for the learners who should have been doing English and maths, not actually doing English and maths. It's got only 10 high need students. They automatically draw down 6,000 each. And obviously the top-up funding from the local authority will be additional to this allocation. This institution had some very highly costed A-level students in the past. So it had formula protection applied in 2016. If it did, it will have it again this coming year. That obviously dwindles in size, so by the time we get to 2020, that will disappear. And you can see that there's a fair number of learners drawing down free meals, etc. So that's how the allocation that you would have got would have appeared to you, taking account of all those conditions. As I said, the most important condition, other than obviously making sure that the hours that you're offering put the learner in the right band, as well as obviously the performance based on how many students you've recruited, as well as retention the previous year. The other condition, obviously, is the English and Maths condition. We know that's applied since 14-15. It only applies to those learners who have programs of 150 or more hours. There's not many learners, by the way, with programs of less than 150. And obviously those qualifications that those learners are required to do must be off the approved list. So if they haven't yet attained a grade A star to C or grade 4 to 9, obviously with the new GCSEs, which obviously can only be offered now, then obviously they have to be doing English and Maths. And if they haven't attained either English and Maths, the assumption is they'd be enrolling and studying both English and Maths in any year. The point at which they're actually put in for the exam, that's up to you as the professional to determine, and that might happen sometimes in the first year, sometimes in the second year. Now, as we know, there was an additional condition imposed from 15-16, which has created problems for us, for full-time students, who, of course, if they got a grade D, were required to resit GCSE in their study programs. Obviously, that would apply to anyone who didn't get a grade 4 in the new GCSEs. The only exception would have been on traineeships, because they are treated as part-time programs, and they would be more preferably doing things like functional skills. Now, we expected that condition to, because of some of the things we were told, certainly around March and April, but it does look now as if that condition will continue to be applied. Now, obviously, the approved qualifications are subject to revision after this summer. Some of those, what we call legacy GCSEs and IGCSEs, will no longer count. So in effect, we are looking in future, certainly for 17-18 and beyond, at the new GCSEs. And obviously the new functional skills are on their way as well. ESOL, as long as it's accredited by Ofqual, can be used as a stepping stone, and a range of entry and level 1 QCF qualifications, again, that meet the requirements, are approved qualifications. So generally those students who would be doing either a GCSE reset, a functional skill, or maybe a smaller qualification because they might be at entry and pre-entry level. Some learners who are on, say, 12-week programs such as the Princess Trust, they might be doing TEAM, which includes English and Maths. But also, don't forget, some of your learners might simply skip the GCSE, or they might skip the functional skill and move on to a level 3 qualification. Those, again, have got to be off the approved list. I don't think there are any issues about that approved list. I think the clarification that we need is that there's got to be some flexibility when the student sits the exam. I think the critical thing from the point of view of meeting the requirements for both funding and for Ofsted is that those lessons in English and Maths, whatever level they are, whatever the outcome is, they are timetabled and learners are encouraged to attend. And even if we're using blended learning, we're still recording whether they've actually logged on and logged off and they're progressing in the subject. And I think that doesn't change, but clearly you can see how this become an important aspect for Ofsted in terms of what's happening in terms of progress. And obviously, if a learner does a functional skill first and then progresses to a GCSE, so they do a stepping stone first and then they complete the stepping stone and then move on to a GCSE, we know that that qualification has got to occur for at least 6 weeks for it to be actually to count towards meeting the condition. And obviously that's got some important implications. By the way, if it's a shorter program, that minimum period they've got to do the English or Maths GCSE has got to be 2 weeks. There's a bit of flexibility because people on less than 150 hours are not required to meet the condition. However, you should evidence that those learners are still improving their literacy and numeracy or Maths and English skills. Some small-time, part-time programs are also exempt from the additional condition of the grade Ds, people on Job Centre Plus programs, traineeships as already mentioned, although we must encourage those learners wherever possible to do some English and Maths to evidence that that's happening, whether it be embedded, contextualized, whatever. But there's a lot of flexibility in the way in which we deliver it, and it's good to see that providers are increasingly being a little bit more confident in the way in which they do the English and Maths. The flexibility, obviously most of us have not fallen foul of the actual condition of funding. We're well within the tolerance, which does indicate some success. However, there is nevertheless still an issue around how that impacts on overall achievement and attainment in your organisation, and then that's viewed by Ofsted, and I'll come back to that. As I said, we expected a change in the policy, the indications whether DFE might do so, but as such that hasn't happened, and that's, I think, a disappointment, because this is creating, I think, failure being built into the system. Some of us are gaming by just simply putting all the students, not just the grade Ds, but the E's and the F's on GCSEs, and obviously seeing if they move up from, say, an F to an E, we count that as a significant progress and value added, rather than maybe what might be more appropriate to that learner's destination, or what might be better for them in learning, in improving their learning and skills. So I think there's some issues there, but we'll come back to some of those in terms of inspection. Any questions at this point? Yeah, one of you did ask about the tolerance being applied to 17-18. It will apply, but it will be obviously based on the data from 15-16. So it won't be last year's data, it'll be the 15-16 data. And that will then would have been applied to your allocation for 17-18. So the only institutions that have lost anything for non-compliance would have been ones where more than 5% of your students by value, that's the size of those students as well as the numbers, had not enrolled in an approved qualification in these subjects. So that is answered there. However, one word of warning, it's not enough just to stay within what I'd call the funding compliance. You know, you might meet the funding requirement, but I think from the point of view of improving the Maths and English skills of your learners, I think we should still be more emphatic on that, and maybe think of more innovative and more creative ways of getting more buy-in, both from the learners as well as in some cases their teachers. So I think that's why I've put that point at the bottom. Now, when it comes to inspection, and this is more looking at the quality side, how we meet Ofsted's requirements. If you look at Ofsted's handbook for inspecting study programs, what inspectors are asked to look at. If you look at, for example, the Ofsted's dashboard, which is a tool for showing historic outcomes data, which evaluates the effectiveness of study programs, particularly based on level 3 provision in relation to things like level 1 and 2. That dashboard, if you look at it, reflects what really should be in a study program. So the key theme here is that the design of your study program must include all the key elements: core, English, Maths, work experience, non-qualification, such as tutorial, careers, etc. That, I think, is the first thing to look at. And they've found some study programs have not included those elements, or been very, very much based on a historical model of individual quals with some additionalities thrown together with no sense of cohesion or of a clear path. And I'll come back to that. I think what has been a key issue has been the effectiveness of careers advice and guidance, and at last that's being addressed with more emphasis on what the school should be doing to make sure that those people progressing into post-16 have made better decisions in terms of their courses that they're doing, the qualifications they're doing. I think still a big emphasis is on the consistency of quality of teaching, learning, assessment, particularly where it's looking at things like pace and challenge. And how often do you see in inspection reports recently, for example, in the last few weeks, study programs where that's not been consistent, where students haven't been challenged or students at the lower end have not been offered enough support. I've talked a fair bit about the learner development of English and maths skills. That is a recurrent feature in a lot of inspection reports. But it's not, for me, the main reason why providers are not getting good grades for the study programs. It's a combination of all of these factors, including the retention on the study program and the extent to which learners achieve their goals. We've got poor attendance on some study programs, poor retention on some elements of it. It's not consistent. And particularly what's happening to current learners. One of the inspectors that worked with me last week kept on wanting to emphasize, saying what is happening to the progress of your current learners. It's not just your historical data. What kind of outcomes are they going to achieve? That emphasis is quite significant. And it's almost like an assiduous monitoring, tracking of student performance in year to make sure that there's no student allowed to go any period of time without that being resolved. So as well as obviously what they're doing in terms of progressing to the destinations, notably higher education, employment, self-employment, and increasingly, how many of your learners are progressing into apprenticeships. One other point just to note, which I've picked up from recent inspection reports, is that some of you have not given enough attention to narrowing the achievement gap between different groups of learners. So in terms of equality and diversity, for example, those learners with low attainment when they came in, those learners from different ethnic groups, those learners with different individual needs such as disabilities. We've already spent a fair bit of time in previous webinars looking at issues to do with safeguarding as a wide concept, including things like e-safety, prevent, British values. That still features in inspection reports, less so now, but nevertheless it still creates some concerns in the fact that after some time, some providers are still struggling to do that, as well as the issues to do with equality and diversity, which I've already commented on, but also some concerns about the quality of work placements, not only the quantity of placements available, but sometimes the value of those placements, and I'll pick those up. For the, and I've not updated this for the inspection reports in April and May. This was up till this was up to the end of March. But up to the end of March, I've excluded all of the sixth form colleges and general FE colleges which had short inspections, because we can assume that if they still kept the grade 2s, the grade 2 would have still applied to the study program. So this is just the inspections of general FE and sixth form colleges and tertiary colleges up till the end of March, 104 inspections, and these are the grades just for study programs. So this is just the study program grades. And I think it does show that there's, and this was, don't forget, after 4 years of implementation of study programs, 3 or 4 years, we still have problems about the quality in all of those characteristics that I just described that are being picked up, particularly through the dashboard, through Raise online and things like that, but also through what they found through looking at you, through observation, through walkthroughs, through the actual long inspections, the longer inspections. The fact that if you look at it, just over 62% of those institutions, 62%, almost 63%, the actual grade given for study programs was requires improvement or inadequate. And that is obviously quite concerning. And that's something that I think all of us then will need to concentrate on. And that's why I'm going to pick some of those particular things up. But certainly from those things that I've mentioned, you know, entry requirements, internal progression, particularly induction not being effective, and the actual model of study programs, including tutorials and work experience, obviously raise some concerns. The other area of concern that I think you should be aware of is that during the area review process, which is now, of course, complete, What did start to come through, and there are now some stage 2 reviews going on where we've brought in the schools and other data. How relevant was our study program offer across the piece to local needs and priorities? For example, how well did we activate the not in education employment training? Where were those learners progressing to internally within the institutions to higher qualifications or programs or bigger programs, but also externally to jobs, to apprenticeships? And therefore we pulled in the data on student performance, the quality of your provision and financial performance to also be able to show whether the study program offers were cost effective, not just effective, but also cost effective. And one key theme that now keeps coming up, which also I think is important for inspection, is the extent of employer engagement. How well do you engage with employers when you design and deliver study programs? Not just for work placements and work experience, but also for projects, and particularly for those learners who want to follow a shorter program such as a traineeship or a supported internship, which is, sorry, not a shorter program, but also for supported internships where, you know, at least 6 months of the program is actually spent on a work placement for those learners with individual learning needs. So I think there's some key messages there. And I know that that's led to some issues, certainly when we've looked at that data comparatively across an area and now comparing it, of course, increasingly to schools. So those are the sort of issues that have been raised. What to, you know, just to finish off now, well, if we've got it and we need to see, is there some kind of performance issue that you've got, whether it be in terms of number of people on study programs, number of people that are being retained on programs, then I think what is key here is that we get the right design of programs. Now, we've got a question from John asking, if a learner goes into work during the training, for example, leaves for a job, is this a positive destination? Well, obviously, John, if the original aim of the learner, when you designed the program in their individual learning plan, was my main purpose of doing a study program is to go into employment, preferably with an apprenticeship, then achieving that destination obviously means they've attained the outcome for that program. Now, this is particularly important if people are on traineeships or pre-apprenticeship type programs as part of your study program offer. So in other words, if they achieve their learning aim, but not necessarily retain to the end of the program, we have this issue constantly with traineeships, then that would be seen as a measure. Of course, what is important is how long they go into the job. So it's a minimum of so many hours per week for so many weeks before it becomes a positive destination. So I hope that answers your question, John, particularly relevant if those learners that you're talking about were on, say, a supported internship, a traineeship, or a pre-apprenticeship program. So in other words, the job was the primary outcome and not necessarily the qualifications. There are obviously issues there if the learners are not allowed to carry on studying their qualifications on the job. For example, if they're not allowed to continue their programs as part of an apprenticeship, then obviously that's got implications for the individual learning aims in terms of being attained. But hopefully that answers your question. There is a minimum length of time that they must be in a job and a minimum number of hours that that job must take up. And those are the performance measures which apply, which if you look at they're part of the performance measures, certainly for traineeships, whether they apply to young people or young adults. Now, what are the implications? Good question there, thank you. What are the implications for the way we design it? Now, I want to go back, way back to 2012-13 when we first came up with the models, the first models for study programs. And some of you might remember this, that when you sit down and design a 16 to 19 curriculum, say for 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 learners, you actually are looking at a very different approach from anything we've done in the past when it was just about individual qualifications. We've got to say that the key driver here is, what is the initial destination of that learner? In other words, as they're in transition from Key Stage 4, and obviously the initial advice and guidance is critical, the right information is given to them, the right advice, the right guidance, they know the entry requirements and know the requirements of the program, they know where they're going. Initial assessment is done to make sure that they have got the right skills, the right balance of skills, that, for example, we've taken account of not only the literacy and numeracy, but their aptitude, their vocational aptitude, the clarity. Are they clear about what expectations? That drives each study program. So if you've got 3,000 learners, you've got 3,000 study programs. Each individual study program needs to have that thought applied to it. We then deliver the study program, which has got to be wrapped round in a more holistic way, not individual calls, but how they all come together. And it's got to take account of that individual's destination. It's got to be personalized. So the right combination of qualification and non-qualification hours here is critical. Do we get that balance between the work experience, the tutorial, the study skills, and that diploma, that certificate, those A levels? Taking account of the fact that a new aspect of inspection is personal development, behaviour and welfare, those all have to be looked at not only in the design of the study programme, but in the teaching, learning, assessment, in the outcomes for the learners, and in leadership and management. And then making sure that the teaching, learning, assessment does achieve the destination the learner has. At the very end of that process, we then go back to those outcomes, particularly for key stage 5 measures, such as the one that John talked about in terms of a positive destination. Then those learners have to be given the advice, the guidance to take them to the next stage, which could be internally. And one of the problems I've got is how often internal progression, we just assume because they've done the level 1, they'll move on to level 2. The level 2 will move on to a 2-year level 3. And yet we haven't looked at things like what was their attitude to learning, what was their attendance like, and flagging up those learners at risk. So there's some big issues there. So that progression in destinations has got to be looked at carefully. And I've got some concern, particularly over progressing students that internally progress, sometimes without the same attention, the same care that would have been given to new starts. And obviously that then feeds into your key stage 5 measures at 18 or 19 in terms of progression, in terms of attainment, in terms of all the things that appear in the what do you call it, Ofsted dashboard, value added, for example. So how do we put those elements together? We know that the elements should be a substantial qualification, which can be academic or a larger vocational qualification, certificate or diploma. It could be a traineeship. It could be an extended period work experience with employability attached to it. English and Maths have not already achieved a grade 4 or better. Work experience in whatever shape or form best meets that. There's no one model. There's got to be different models. And then other non-qualification activities such as tutorials, employability and study skills, which you put on. Enterprise education might be useful for some of your A-level students, running a mini company, enrichment in terms of sport and other activity. All of these elements should be combined, in the words of the DFE, to provide stretch and challenge for the student, to prepare them for employment for further study. So without that design in mind, without that much more holistic approach, we then get into the detail of what's in your model. And I always say, whoever you are, if you want me to look at the model, I'm quite happy for you to send me a copy, and that would be an offer from today. Send me your study program offer, your model, how pre-entry, entry, level 1, level 2 and level 3 students on average will have some kind of plan of activity. That allocation of hours will be, hopefully will be more holistic and personalized, not just about individual silos, individual quals. It's how does that all contribute to that learner's destination, the outcome they're seeking. What's the core learning aim? So it might be a level 2 certificate, it could be an extended certificate, it could be a diploma, it could be 3 or 4 A levels, it could be a traineeship based on, say, 200 hours of work experience. What English and Maths are being offered, at what level, how much, and then how do you make up the rest of the program in terms of enrichment, tutorial and other things. So that's the key element for each learner. That has got to be critical in ensuring that you meet the funding requirement, minimum 540 hours for 16, 17-year-olds, minimum 450 hours for 18-year-olds, but also, you know, in terms of the funding condition for English and Maths, as well as making sure those activities actually take place. Then you can start looking at how each one of those costs, how much of it's face-to-face done by teachers, how much is done by tutors, personal tutors, how much is online, how much is blended learning, what kinds of staff do you use for different activities, how do you organize the groups, how do you bring the classes together for some activities and split them up for others. And I think all of that is critical, and it's something that we've spent some time in the past looking at, particularly when we're looking at the efficiency of study programs. But at the same time, do not lose sight of the fact that you've got this other condition, which is both a funding condition, but also a quality condition in terms of English and maths. And what resourcing and timetable you put into those, and whether you do that first or you give it priority over other areas, is critical. So at this point, there are some quite significant challenges. And just got a question by there, just go back to that slide. You talked about a tutorial, and the question that's being posed here is, what do you think is best, progress coaches or personal tutors? I take it when you say personal tutors, you mean tutors who would tend to be vocational staff who record progress against qualification aims. Yeah, whereas a progress coach might not be a vocational tutor. They could be a coach, a mentor, a learning facilitator. I mean, my personal view is I've seen both systems work really well because people were trained, people were qualified, people had good communication systems. So even if you had a progress coach, they constantly were in contact with the vocational staff to record the progress against qualification aims, as well as the more generic issues around personal development, behaviour and welfare, attendance, target setting, etc. I've also seen personal tutors who are vocational staff work really well, where again, they've got the training in tutoring, they've got the right attitude. I've also seen both of those produce bad results. Students floating around in the system, not having clear targets and feeling really let down by the system. And then obviously their attitude starts to slip, their attendance starts to slip, and we see all the problems. So my general response to that question, thanks very much for the question, is either one of those will work well if they're properly implemented, properly resourced and properly trained for. My personal feeling is if you've got good vocational staff who've also got good pastoral skills, that would always give you the best of both worlds. And I think that would be my sort of an experienced response there. And it's not just, the problem is, I sometimes ask, why have you introduced those progress coaches? And sometimes I get it's just to reduce cost. Well, the big issue you face there is obviously what's going to happen to quality. So basically, once you've got that concept in mind, once you've got the principle in mind of a destination-led, individualized, holistic model, then you've got three decisions. What's the best model of delivery for the different elements? How do we manage that? And then what structures, in terms of your organizational structures, will deliver the study program quality that you want, if it's improvement in cost effectiveness or just an improvement in effectiveness. So there are various things that you can look at. I'm going to look at some of these different approaches. Flipping, more blended online learning, how you get more work experience but also better work experience, more effective integration of English and maths, central timetabling for tutorial enrichment and English and maths, which is a key model, different types of staff that can be used for different activities, and new organizational structures. Now, there are lots of other things you could put in, but I've just focused on these because I see them as key issues. One model, which I know some of you have tried, is to actually change the concept of a study program. So the core is not the vocational or academic study. The core is that entitlement which all learners get, which are critical for meeting the funding requirements, retaining the learners and progressing them. So it's a more holistic approach. So in effect, English, maths and digital skills for many learners will be part of their core. They might have already qualified in English and maths, but what we say is we're trying to improve their English and maths through their vocational or their academic study. A work experience or work placement, particularly where the students are seeking to progress to employment, to apprenticeships, or where it's mandatory part of their program, early years for example, but also where you're extending the students' vista or view of the world, such as A-level students. Tutorial and enrichment activities, careers education has got to be critical. We do it better than many other providers, but that doesn't mean we're perfect, as well as obviously making sure personal development, behaviour and welfare feature in the way in which we deliver that model. Now, where those are delivered as a core does not mean that there are specified contact staff for those. They can be permeated and embedded throughout the vocational and academic, which goes around the core. So once you've got the core, you can then put vocational, academic and other experiences around that core. That emphasis will change as the level of the learner changes. So you can see that, for example, in one institution, and that isn't, by the way, a straight line, it's quite fluid. What they've done is they say that at the lower levels, the learners come into the study program, they have more core activity. Why? the two main reasons why learners can't succeed in the labour market is very low levels of English and maths and employability skills and not enough experience in the world of work. So you're not doing them any favours by giving them a big vocational or academic study when in fact they haven't got the basic elements that allow them A, to study, and B, to progress. So you can see that as the level of the learner gets higher, there's more emphasis on the vocational academic because the learner has got those core skills, has acquired those, and that's why they're able to do a higher level of perhaps vocational or academic. So that's one model, and I know that one of you has already, thank you, one of you said that that's exactly what you're trying to do. And it isn't just a straight line, it can be quite jagged, and it can also depend on some of the learners as well as some of the areas of study. But I do think it's critical, and that's why, for example, at entry level, we often spend much more time on English, maths, digital skills, employability skills, and less on the vocational. Why? Because without those skills, they can't progress to the next level, and they can't really benefit from that vocational or academic study. So just something for you to think about. Another issue that comes up in terms of the design is also how do we implement much more of the sort of blended learning, e-learning, new technology into. This is from another institution that I've worked with, which says, right, well, in terms of making sure the learners have got the skills to cope with those higher levels of study, the world of work and the world of HE, we should be doing a higher proportion of the delivery through things like e-learning, online and blended learning, and less through face-to-face delivery. Here's one model. It's only a rough and ready model, but you can see that as the level of the learner rises, the proportion of time they spend face-to-face with tutors, lecturers, teachers is less, and the more time spent online through e-learning increases. Now, these are only rough and ready indicators, and of course, because of the variability around them. But what you can start to see is this is not particularly driven by cost-effective efficiency. It's driven by things like what skills do those learners need if they're going to progress and if they're going to succeed in the world of work or higher education. And certainly at level 3, a lot of those learners will be going into HE where a significant proportion of the programs are delivered online. Key issue about this is that it's the quality of support for those learners when they go online. It's the quality of training they have. It's how well the staff support them. So this has still got high investment cost. I've seen some great examples and I'll come back to those, but essentially that new technology aspect of study programs has been a particular disappointment in terms of what Ofsted is seeing, but also in terms of what we found through JISC, etc., where there isn't as much thought or as much investment as we would have anticipated. We know the advantages are they help learners with information advice. So in other words, you can have a digital assistant here. Good example of that, by the way, if you want to, we had a good demonstration last Friday at the Northwest Quality Managers Conference in near Preston from Bolton College. I think it was Aftab Hussain. If you Google ADA, ADA, which is a digital assistant, it's a good example of how that's being introduced. And it does all of these things. It can assist learners with, it can improve motivation, it can provide learners with immediate feedback as it moves through its phases. It's a digital assistant which answers questions initially, such as, you know, where do I get information about finance? When is the library open? What is UCAS? Phase 2 is looking at enabling contextualized responses posted by the students. For example, how well am I doing with my studies? When do I have to take my next assignment? What's my timetable? I can also send messages to teachers. And phase 3 of that is enabling teachers and support teams to trigger actions, which might be relevant to a student in their care. So show me how student X is doing on the academic dashboard, which students are behind targets. So you can see that the new technology is not only helping the students in study programs, it's also helping the staff and different support. So you can use it for all those reasons. And here's some examples. Certainly, I've given you an example from Bolton, from Barking and Dagenham College. One of the comments from students, they use Google Drive there, is how they use that to improve their work. And sometimes I like to work on my own, away from the noisy classroom. I can also do that at home, to giving the learner more flexibility and more autonomy. So I think that's got to be something we start to gradually start to see more. Can I just ask those listening in, how many of you have started to implement new technology, e-learning in study programs, and what's been the result of it, to what effect? Yeah. Yeah, good, some of you, brilliant. Using Google Drive, yeah. Using different types of virtual learning environment. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Taking a bit of time. I mean, the problem is, it has to be something which is given the right investment, either internally or externally, by securing funding from other sources. Others have put very little. And I think that's disappointing, given that, you know, we've got some good stuff out there, which I think is quite interesting. There's a lot of very, very good quality material available either to purchase or to get sponsored. And look not only at those examples, look at, for example, an organisation I'm associated with, Learning Curve, at some of the stuff they've got, and other organisations. But certainly best to network with people working in the same sort of type of institution as you and see what they're doing. Certainly I would have a good look at the work being done at Bolton College with ADA, that's ADA, and just put ADA Digital Assistant and you'll get some good information on that. And I think there are significant benefits. I wouldn't need to rehearse them anymore, but I think they are ones that you should look at as long as there's the proper investment. Now, the other area that is concerned us slightly is work experience, and I just want to remind you of the DFE definition of what is meaningful work experience. This is what inspectors expect to see. So it's got to meet all those conditions. It's got to be purposeful. It's got to offer challenge. It's got to be managed under your direction. It's your supervision. It's got to be a good use of time. It's got to involve active involvement of the employer. For example, for the period of the work placement. It's got to be clear what their expectations are of everyone that's involved, and you've got to measure what its impact is. Now, you can see that all of those must be design features of your work experience program. We've got a question there. Good. Who organizes work experience in the organizations that you work with? In every organization, including our own, we have a management role with a team to support it. So that means that they find the placements, they advertise them, they select the students, they engage with the employers, they provide support in the workplace. Some of the support comes from workplace assessors. They monitor progress using ProMonitor and OneFile. They monitor outcomes, they do feedback from the students, feedback from the employers, they measure impacts, celebrate outcomes and achievements. That's a team that does all of that, and that is there to support the curriculum. So this is a dedicated team. Well, if you've got 3,500 study program students, you deserve to have a good investment in meeting that requirement. We try, certainly a governor of a medium-sized college where we've got just under 3,500 learners, and they're all vocational, we don't do academic subjects. That is the entitlement we've said to each student. And obviously as a governor, that's reported back to us as well. So what we think has come out from that exercise is, first of all, some quite interesting ways to extend the offer. How do we get 3,500 placements? Well, we use business development teams, workplace assessors and recruitment agencies to find the placements. We also own a recruitment agency. We grow our apprenticeship offer. We have about 3,000 apprentices. When the apprentices come in and do day release, we replace them with a student on a work placement from our study program. Good. There's another question here, another comment about that. Yes, if you want to evidence assessment, I think it's important that you've got some system for assessing, for recording their attendance on a work placement, if they do it as a block. Now, it's difficult, therefore, to have a register. What we've tended to use is them signing in and signing out at the workplace. And that's sent back to us at the end of every week. So we do it weekly, if we've got students on a work placement that's a full week or a whole block. If they're doing something like a 2-week block, it's done at the end of week 1 and the end of week 2. If the students are doing a day a week, say over 12 weeks, say our art and design students who work in local schools, then that register comes back to us, or that lot signing in and signing out sheet comes back to us at the end of each day. So it depends purely on the administrative there, but by using ProMonitor, we can obviously make all of this happen quite quickly electronically. So as long as you're recording the attendance on either a weekly basis or a daily basis, if it's 1 day a week spread over several weeks, I think you'll be okay. And it's not going to be necessarily a register. It can be a signing in sheet, a time sheet, or something else but we always ask the employer to sign it off. Creating learning companies with employer help means that we're providing work experience to some of our more academic learners. Dragging den simulations where we ask the employers to come in and judge the type of project that the students want to do in the work placement has actually engaged a lot of employers because they're also getting the benefit of actually solving a real workplace problem. We use the primary and secondary schools in our pyramid at Chesterfield College to provide us with work experience offers for art and design students, music students, sports students, who often go in and help, particularly in primary schools. They might offer an afternoon a week for, say, several weeks where they provide the school with some specialist support in sport, music, art and design, where the teacher might not have that specialism. We've allowed some of our students to take over a hotel, campsite, and other leisure activities for a period of time, and that's been a really good approach with the support, obviously, of the employer. We've also found that more employers will offer us more places if we give them discounted prices for short courses or to use our college facilities, as well as obviously our training provider partner facilities. So there are all kinds of ways of extending the work experience offer, and obviously you might have tried all of these, but I think what is important there is that once we've extended the offer, we also have to improve the quality of the offer. And here we've contextualized it so that before any students go out on a placement, their course before prepares them. So our students who are interested in retail have a whole lot of preparation before they go out to do their placement with Next. So it's very relevant to what they do. We use customized learning packages which help being written up by them while they're on their placement or updating their CV. For those learners that haven't yet decided on a pathway, we offer them short tasters where they're maybe less confident. We also make more effective use of our internal work placements as a preparation for external placements, particularly for those students who haven't quite determined what pathway they want to do. But also we found that we embed English and Maths into their work experience so that whenever they do their work experience, they're also improving their English, Maths, digital skills. And I'll show you that in a second. Thanks very much for those sort of other things that you've made a note about. Using, for example, recruitment agencies, working with your supply chain. Again, good ways of increasing the number of placements and the quality of placements. In terms of English and Maths, which is featured, as I said, in inspection reports, we've actually found that that's worked a lot better. For example, when we situated English and Maths in familiar environments where they're taught in the place that they normally do their science and their hairdressing, their engineering, or they're actually given English and Maths activities to do while on work experience. There's some good stuff there from the ALIN who have produced some nice materials on that. But you can see that if you look at ETF, AELP, all of these agencies, LMAG, they've got lovely case studies which show to connect English and Maths with vocational context. These are really good case studies for you to look at because then they show you that other people have implemented, and it's good to network with them. I think appropriate timetabling and allocation hours comes right through in the design. If you believe in the core, then let's give English and Maths for level 1 and 2 students some significant emphasis or importance on the timetable. The issue here is capacity. Have we got enough English and Maths teachers or other teachers with English and Maths skills that can actually cover that range? That's one of the big issues. More effective use of e-learning materials for Stretch and Challenge. We've done that for converting functional skills to GCSEs and also for linear programs where there's more emphasis on external. Some good stuff there. We also use the vocational and specialist staff in different ways. Vocational staff can do the more generic, the more relevant, the more embedded stuff. The specialist English and maths staff can do the stuff that's then preparing them for assessment, etc. As well as the use of different types of social media, Google Drive, Twitter, etc., to reinforce and encourage collaborative learning. So all of these are things that we've done. For example, this is for work experience. When students on work experience, whatever they do each week, we've agreed with the employer, the workplace, the work experience coordinator, then identifies the English, maths and employability skills that are needed for each task. The learners that complete the task also evidences what English and maths they've covered. And we use a one-file approach to record all of those activities electronically. So the learners come back with an electronic portfolio from their work experience that also shows the English, maths and employability skills. As I said, centralized timetabling. I now know that almost all of you listening in, and certainly all of our partners, they think English and maths is that critical, it's put onto the timetable first, along with other aspects of the core, and that gives it centrality. It means that we can get more viable group sizes. It also means we emphasize to everyone in the organization how important English and maths timetabling, English and maths are, that they're given those key parts of the timetable first. And obviously, that also means we can group them by level and group them by subject area, particularly we've got that centralized approach. We've done a lot on this in other webinars. Just want to emphasize also that model that one of you asked me about, right combination of expertise. With very familiar settings for English and maths, particularly for vocational students, we tend to use more of this vocational staff. The blue is the vocational staff, the orange is the specialist. As the learners grow in their confidence in the use of English and maths, and we move them into less familiar situations, which of course will be assessed either through functional skills or through GCSEs, then you get a much greater proportion of the time being spent with the specialist English and maths tutors. So if we're giving the students 102, 108 hours for each GCSE, then you can see how we allocate that time accordingly, depending obviously on the skills of the vocational staff. So in terms of having the right models, you know, the delivery models, it's important that we then put those elements together into then managing the delivery of that model. And whether it be through the curriculum areas or through dedicated study program managers, the key thing here is to make sure that each program is individualized, that we have the right staff delivering on that program, but not necessarily without compromising quality. I can get cheaper staff, it's the quality that matters, and then the appropriate use of technology, but also getting, and this is what I found quite critical, is do we get the internal teams, the different curriculum areas, to sit down and plan that more holistic approach to study programs? Do you do that in your organization? So you've got cross-curriculum teams, theme project work, which does then mean that we bring more of it together and the students don't see this as an individual collection of qualifications. So here we've got a fairly typical year one A-level student, quite a clever student here, obviously got English and maths already. You can see how they're doing the 4A levels. The tutorial is there. This is being delivered by progress coaches that have contact with the academic staff. In some cases, they have got the academic background. They also do at least 3 hours of one-to-one. That's actually 6 half-hour sessions where they review individual academic progress against target, as well as the other issues around attendance. One of you has asked, by the way, do those progress tutors deliver group tutorials? They do. The group tutorials follow a program that includes British values, careers, IT, etc., environmental. It's a program that I think this provider, based on, I think, Gwent College in Wales, a very, very rich, resource-rich program of tutorial which covers all those things. These students also do a learning company. If they're not necessarily going on to do a work experience, they run a learning company supported by an employer, supported by a workplace tutor. That takes up the equivalent of a week. Those learners that are going on to progress to HE also have a program delivered online, which is Stretch and Challenge, that's done through webinars. So those learners have to log on, They follow a webinar, say for 45 minutes, and then there is obviously some assessment of their learning. So you can see how that £4,000 student, if they're 16, 17, how the 658 hours, they meet the minimum condition of 540, there's the funding condition, they've already got English and Maths, there's that condition out the way, and here it's meeting the needs for them to progress into obviously year 2. So obviously that comes together. This is a level 2 program for progression. Here you can see they're doing a certificate, a vocational certificate, which includes a wee bit of supervised study time. 2 groups come together for this one. They do 1 module together with 1 member of staff following an e-learning pack. So we've got 2 groups, that's about 30 students coming together with 1 member of staff, but they're following a learning pack. That member of staff is there to supervise them. It obviously is about the capacity of your learning spaces. Again, 37 hours of tutorial, some group, some one-to-one. Work preparation is done and experience, that's managed by the external employer. And the English and Maths, they have 102 hours each. I would assume in this case there could be some functional skills, some GCSEs. But you notice we're bumping up the hours for the core here. The total program 616 hours. We then decide who delivers it. There's different types of staff deliver it. So the learner's hours are there. How much is done by the lecturer? We can see that 510 hours is delivered by lecturers through a group. Some is done individually by a mentor or a progress coach. Some obviously takes account the support they get when they're on the week's work experience. So again, it's making the best use of the right staff with the right skills, no diminution of quality. So with that in mind, my final points really are about how is your organisation responding. As we said, thanks very much for some of the questions that have come. We've had 3 good questions so far. How's it 4 good questions, thank you. How's it responding? Well, this should have been a good opportunity for your institution to say, there's a change in curriculum. It's a very different type of program from what we've done before, a bit like apprenticeships. We should lead some kind of change in the way in which the organisation is now organised and responding. We need more flexible, responsive, adaptive, innovative, proactive, much more focused on outcomes. And that must reflect both the funding requirements, number of hours, and how those hours are audited, and the quality arrangements in terms of what Ofsted's looking for. That means we need a much more holistic approach. So that not only means study programs, but what about adults? What about workplace learning? What about HE? What about apprenticeships? And one structure that I like is to create a matrix where we have a senior leader responsible for all the study programs, and then each one of the curriculum support areas, if you want, makes provision to meet the needs of those learners. But the emphasis here is on the learners and the destinations. Now that requires an open communication system. It means using whatever systems you've got, OneFile, ePortfolio, all those systems coming together, ProMonitor, Pro Solutions. You've got a resource model, a monitoring model, and obviously you've got an impact model, and that brings all those people together. I also think it's good to work with other institutions. For example, this thing we did on Friday at the Northwest Quality Managers brought a whole lot of institutions together to look at the same sort of issues that could affect study programs, as well as working with other organisations such as Careers Academy, etc. And also, in some cases, don't forget, you've got some really good subcontractors who might be able to get you a market or get you a particular approach or find you those learners or supply those learners with good quality teaching, learning, assessment in some areas that you might not have those strengths. So here's my model of the matrix structure. I've seen it introduced in 1 or 2 institutions. We've got senior leader, director of study programs, head of the leadership team. They are in effect commissioning academic, vocational, traineeship and other provision from the curriculum areas. Those curriculum areas have got to meet the requirements that that director lays down, looking at the point of from individual learners. So that director of study programs has got 3,500 learners they're responsible for. Each curriculum area must make sure that when it goes to put its offer in, it meets the needs for a much more holistic, much more innovative, etc. And so that person can set the conditions. You can see English and Maths go right across all of those. But also, there are some areas which are just avoiding doing anything academic. Maybe they haven't got the right A-level or GCSE provision. They focus on something else. You can see also that not all the areas have contributed traineeships traineeships here are based on strengths. So as long as they've got strengths with good employer engagement, that's the ones they'll work with. And I hope that sort of model gives you some sense of what might be needed. So in terms of what Ofsted's looking for, senior person in your organisation, hopefully you've got that. Responsibility for making sure that study programs, we actually have an assistant principal at our institution who has to report to the governors periodically on the plan for study programs and the implementation of study programs. I think it'd be a good idea to do a full-scale review, given you might have had some experiences that didn't work as well. Get that clarity of policy on English, maths, work experience, particularly where Ofsted's looking for more traineeships of higher quality and supported internships. In conclusion, I think as we move into the 5th year of implementation, there is lots of evidence to show innovative approaches to the planning, delivery, management, and monitoring of study programs. That's good, but not enough, and it's not consistent. There are still major concerns about the quality of study programs. I've shown you that. And I think some providers have just not understood that much more holistic approach is needed. So I think the key message I would say is, and hopefully those of you listening in will appreciate it, it's strategic but also operational levels that we've got to make sure that we learn from the best practice of others. And there's no harm in sharing that best practice of others and taking their ideas and implementing them, but carefully and properly with the right resource to make that change happen. Hopefully you would have found that useful, Marek. Thanks very much for all the questions that have come in. We've taken a few more questions, actually 6 questions. They're quite substantial questions. And obviously, as I said, to those of you listening in, use this webinar to maybe initiate a discussion in your organization about, well, how well have we done on study programs and what are we planning to do? This could provide as you want, the stimulus for an ongoing discussion, particularly in the way in which you shape what's happening next year. I know you've already laid down many of your plans, timetables, etc., but there's no harm in reviewing them in the light of some of the things that I've covered. And if anyone wants to send me the study program model, how they allocate the hours between core and vocational, between core and vocational academic by level. If you've got a model, I'll have a look at it and give you some feedback and maybe ask you some pertinent questions. So, by the way, for that person asked about the 3A level student of 16-17, can I just remind you, it's 450 hours for the 3A levels, 36 hours for tutorial, 36 hours for study skills, yeah, and 30 hours for UCAS preparation, open days, guest speakers. Comes to 552. So there you are. You've met the funding requirement, and also you've got, I think, a good shaped program there that will help that learner progress to HE. Thanks very much then. Thanks, Marek.
Excellent stuff. Thank you very much, Beej, and thank you for the input from all you participants. Hopefully that was helpful for you. If you just let us know any feedback that you've got. If there's anything you think we missed or any questions that this has raised, please let us know. You've got our contact details. I'll be also making sure that you'll receive a copy of this video recording and slides. And again, as B says, I encourage you to share these with the teams. If you're watching this on the video now, you'll have our contact details, so please get in touch. And
the one thing one thing I want to add, Marek, before you finish the recording,
okay,
you know, I just want to add is, why might this be an appropriate time? Well, look, you've got the new AS and A levels being implemented. From 2018-19 and beyond, we've got the new T level quals. We've got the new English and Maths quals coming on, and we need to improve performance there. You know, the new Key Stage 5 performance measures are coming in. So you can see quite a lot of reasons why this is a good time to fully review your study program offer. And obviously, as Marek says, we're quite willing to help you out with that. And there are our details at the very end there in terms of myself and obviously e-Memoir. Thanks very much for the Marek, and thank everyone for the questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye now.
Bye.